Well, thank you all so much for joining us for understanding the voting behavior of young people. Learn what the research says about why some young people vote and others do not. And this is led by Dr. Bobbi Gentry, who's an associate professor of political science at Bridgewater College. Dr. Gentry earned her master's and Ph.D. degrees from the City University of New York in political science with an emphasis in political psychology. And her current research includes youth voting behavior, teaching and learning in political science, and elections. I again want to thank the Friends of the Library, all the partnering libraries, and I also want to thank the Bridgewater College Speakers Bureau, and most of all want to thank Dr. Gentry for squeezing us in between classes. So everyone watching live, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Dr. Gentry for joining us this morning. And Dr. Gentry, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Robert. And I do want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here this morning, as well as the Friends of the Library. This is a fantastic opportunity. This is often a topic area that comes up during presidential election years is, oh, the youth vote. And so what I'm really going to focus on today is why young people vote and talking about some of the different dimensions. But I would love questions from you at the end. It's going to be a fantastic ride, and feel free if there's something that I haven't covered. I'm more than happy to include and answer any questions that you might have. So I've actually been working on youth voting behavior for over 20 years. Part of this reason why this is my background. I was a young person in college who was denied the right to vote in my college town by the local registrar, and was actually threatened by the Board of Elections to be thrown in jail for incorrectly registering to vote. So part of this journey has really been about rethinking these ideas about what it means to engage. But also a lot of the literature in political science tends to focus on why young people do not vote. And I think if we focus on the flip side of that coin, why young people do vote, then actually we'll get some more concrete information and find ways to encourage voting behavior. So I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen and go ahead and start the slideshow. Again, thank you so much for being here with me today. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about the kind of work that I do and why it's of such value. So, why youth vote? I actually published a book in 2018 entitled Why Youth Vote: Identity, Independence, and Inspirational Leaders, because these are the three major elements that I find tends to encourage young people in participating. So we find these years. So this is 18 to 24-year-olds, and I tend to focus on only 18 to 24-year-olds because those are the early years in which people begin to engage in voting behavior in the United States. However, there are some really fantastic opportunities for younger people in the United States to participate. Like Newark, New Jersey just decreased their school board elections to allow 16-year-olds the right to vote within their school board elections. So there's some really interesting opportunities to decrease the voting age. And that's also a question that we've had in the United States about whether or not we should decrease the voting age or increase the voting age. So we start in 1972, and the reason why we start there as a presidential election year is because the passage of the 26th Amendment. Now, the fascinating thing about the passage of the 26th Amendment, it was actually a result of the 1970 reaffirmation of the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Act. Because in the 1970 Voting Rights Act, federal government wanted to decrease the voting age to 18. However, 4 states decided to oppose this decision, And then we have the case of Oregon v. Mitchell, where the argument was that national government cannot tell states how to run elections. This goes back to the idea of the reserved powers clause, where states get to decide who is allowed to vote in their state, what kind of electoral administration a state is going to have, what kinds of decisions their state's going to make in ballots and access to voting. So these are some really fantastically interesting questions. And the Supreme Court decided in Oregon v. Mitchell, hey, well, national government can decide on national elections, but can't on state and local elections. So it was going to be this huge bureaucratic nightmare for election administration, because you'd have to create two separate roles that would allow voting behavior of those that could vote in federal, state, and local elections, and those that could only vote in federal. That would be 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. So in order to completely avoid this, there was the necessity of a constitutional amendment, which continues to be to this day the fastest ratification of a constitutional amendment in American history. So we start in 1972 because it is the first presidential election year in which 18, 19, and 20-year-olds had the right to vote. Now, you'll notice a couple of different things here. Even with the percent of voting, there are some particular years where there is deep concern for youth voting. And this comes in 1996 and 2000. So it's these real worries that what is happening to young people? Why are they not turning out in elections, especially presidential elections? Because we know that young people are less likely to vote in midterm elections and even less in state and local elections. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But here's the good news, or let's be honest, here's the great news. In 2020, we see the highest participation rate of 18 to 24-year-olds in a presidential election. And there's a couple of different reasons for that, right? One of the things that expanded during the 2020 election was allowing for easier ways for people to be able to register and to vote. And many states, with their Department of Elections, really worked on trying to access and trying to provide access to people about where their ballot was, information about their voter registration. And this was greatly ramped up in 2020 because of the pandemic. So we have a real opportunity to think through, of those people, of those young people that are voting, what's going to happen in 2024? Because there's going to be some very important factors that we have to think through. One of which is, who are the candidates going to be? Because candidates do affect the outcome of an election. Also, what are the major issues? And are the candidates focused on the issues that are important and valuable to young people? But this is the beginning of the story. So my work and my research, I focus on political identity development, which is the process by which people develop a sense of who they are, what they believe, and as a result, act in their political environment. So there's a couple of different elements here that are unique in thinking through how is it that we encourage people to participate. So I argue that it starts with the individual, and this is part of the political psychology piece, that it's the individual that matters. And in that piece, how they create their identity is extremely important in seeing how they're going to either participate or not. And the emphasis here is a developmental process, the process by which we come to understand who we are, what we believe, and then act in that environment. Because it is possible for us, for young people, to see that their political environment doesn't necessarily represent who they are. And so this brings into a really interesting question when we talk about partisan politics, because young people, and this is actually a misnomer, most people think that all young people are liberal, which is actually not the case. It breaks down. About 40% of young people identify as Democrat, about 30% identify as independent, and about 28% identify as Republican. Now, that doesn't add up to 100% because the other 2% is an I don't know. So these opportunities to think about how there's a developmental process that happens, and it might happen earlier for some people and later for others. And so the real opportunity here is to think about what are ways in which organizations, states, or community influences can impact this identity development. So this is the model, and I want to actually, we'll use the zoom in. This is my model in talking about different stages of the process in which people become socialized and become supported by the system or by actors like their parents or schools or peers. And then there's an exploration phase where young people are looking at different types of engagement, looking at different types of identities. And this is where role models really come into play. And one of the most interesting things that we find today is that young people's role models are not necessarily major political figures, but are often their parents or guardians. And that tends to influence their politics. So each one of these stages of the process, an individual is doing work in order to understand who they are. If they don't do the work, then they're going to fall into lower levels, such as diffusions, which is the lowest level. These are individuals who don't think politics matters to them, and they choose not to engage because it doesn't matter to them. Then you're going to have the next level, which is explorers. These are people who are searching for an identity and may practice different types of identity, but are not necessarily settled in their beliefs. Somewhat developed can come from a number of sources. Either a person can be somewhat developed because they have simply taken their identity from a role model, or they are still figuring out the different pieces of their identity. And this is something that's extremely important to understand in politics, is we might have the particular areas that we're interested in, the particular issues that matter to us. We might be really clear in those beliefs, but the beliefs in other areas that we might not have as much information about or passion about are still developing. So the next stage is judgment of others' politics. So this is where young people are looking to role models, and this can be parents, this can be political actors, this can be social media influences. So there's these really interesting questions about, what do I think about other people's politics? Does it make sense to me? Is it something that I can identify with? And this becomes particularly important when we're talking about candidates, because candidates put forward their political identity. They communicate specifically who they are and how they've come to be. So they can act as role models for young people who might want to be like those candidates. And it doesn't mean that they have to be presidential candidates. They could be local candidates. They could be state candidates. It really depends on the level at which young people are paying attention to those roles. Most importantly, for young people to really develop who they are is beginning to self-question. Question what they believe, and how is that the same or different from what others believe? And then the last piece is that political environment piece. So the influence that the political environment has in the United States are things like the two-party system. It might be the question that young people are either going to become partisan or they're going to become independent voters, depending on how well that environment either responds to them or identifies. They're able to identify themselves within that environment. So there's all these different ways in which people can go at these different stages to become more and more developed in their identity, to find out who they are politically and why it matters. So that's the identity process model. Really what we're focusing on here is that you don't just know who you are overnight, but that there are a series of stages that people go through in order to determine their own political identity. And if young people are not going through these stages, then they're less likely to participate. So there are particular things that encourage young people to participate in politics. First and foremost, if you ask people to participate, especially young people, they are likely to participate. Who knew that just sending a text reminder or having their peers encourage them to participate actually increases voter turnout. So this is why on many college campuses, there's these real opportunities to engage and have peer-to-peer contact to encourage others to participate. And let's be very clear, it's not just voting as a participation, but there are other forms of participation, such as gathering information on the important issues to that person, finding out who the candidates are. And we'll talk about why these are directly impactful on the outcomes of voting. For young people, there needs to be very clear connections to their lives in thinking about, why does this matter to me? And this might be the case even with voters who have been voting for a long period of time. But the challenge that we sometimes face for young people is making the connection about why it matters and why their action matters. And so one of the ways in which I talk about encouraging youth participation is that part of encouraging participation is also an opportunity for self-discovery. So a real opportunity to think about, what do I believe? What does the political environment currently have to offer? What are the connections? What are the things that I care about? Are they being talked about? Are these issues that other people care about? So in discussing the impact on their lives, one of the biggest challenges that we find with youth participation is that they tend to do what's called roll-off voting, which means they vote at the top of the ballot for national elections, but at state and local elections, they vote much less. And so what this means is, even if we have young people participating in presidential election years, we're still going to have this important question of, how do we get young people to think about state and local elections? And 2024 is a really important year to be able to do that, because there are elections going on both at the state and local level in many cases, as well as, right, 1/3 of the Senate and half of the or all of the House of Representatives. But in order to make the information real to people's lives, thinking about the impact that everyday rules and regulations like speed limits or potholes, how these directly impact students' lives, and these are made at the state and local level, and that these individuals directly impact what kind of rules and regulations and what kind of impact government is going to have on their lives. One of the most important things, and one of the things that can actually discourage voting, is young people saying that they do not have enough information. This is really fascinating in the information age, where everything is accessible at your fingertips. But I think young people are especially susceptible to these challenges of not knowing where to get reliable information, and what we talk about is this issue of information literacy. So major challenges in being able to evaluate information that's given to them from a variety of sources. Many young people today are getting their information from social media, but the biggest challenge is whether or not they're able to make a decision about how that information is given and why it matters. Accessibility. We find when we make it easier for young people to vote, more young people vote, as well as more older people vote. So part of the reason why in 2020 we saw such an increase in the presidential election was making access to voting easier. So there's this real opportunity, if we want to have more young people participate, then we increase accessibility. Young people also need clarity on voting procedures. So this is one area that we can really improve on in civic engagement, is really teaching young people, what are the different things that you vote on? What happens when you're going into a voting booth? How do you find out where to apply for an absentee ballot? These are things that, as I've been working on youth voting for a number of years, and we have a new campaign this year at Bridgewater called BC Votes, where we engage students as civic engagement scholars in order to encourage other people to participate. There's a lot of logistical questions that young people have. Making sure that we provide how-tos in a number of ways and make it sure that it's accessible to young people. And then making sure that the discussion is on issues that are also important to young people. And so making sure that the issues that are directly impacting young people are going to be addressed and aren't a side note in a presidential election. So this is a youth survey. And one of the biggest challenges, and this is from Circle, from the Tisch Center College of Civic Life at Tufts University. So these are the number one reasons why young people say that they did not vote in the election. So in 2022, which is a midterm election. So they missed the registration time or didn't have time to vote. They were not contacted. So remember that big thing about literally just contacting people to remind them to vote? That's happening much less, especially with young people. Part of the reason why this is because campaigns have a limited amount of resources, both with people resources, but also monetary resources. And so they're going to be strategic to get out voters that have voted in the past. And so young people, it becomes this, what's called a cycle of mutual neglect, where young people aren't necessarily paying attention to elections, and the political parties and candidates aren't paying attention to young people. So it's just this really interesting circle of mutual neglect. And last but not least, this is this really interesting thing that we've seen over the past 10 years, is that young people say that they didn't have enough information to vote. And this can be seen in a number of ways. One, if they didn't know what the candidate stood for, but also I think in that is, where do I find reliable information about what the differences are between the candidates? And this is some really fascinating things that I've seen as teaching American government for a number of years now, is sometimes young people don't know the difference between the political parties, or they believe that the political parties are different from what they actually are and what their political party platform is. And so teaching students where to get that information, teaching young people where to get that information is extremely important. There are things that actually discourage youth participation. Ignoring important issues. So ignoring issues that are important to young people. One of the, I think, fascinating things that many people don't think about is that young people really do care about finances. This is one of the important aspects where young people are thinking through not just government spending, but also, how is it that the economy works? How is it that I'm going to be able to pay off my student loan debt? What are the challenges that I face in order to be able to live day to day? So ignoring important issues to young people are actually going to discourage them because they don't think that the candidates are paying attention to them. Uninspiring candidates. So candidates have the opportunity to tell their identity story. And in telling this identity story, they can be inspirational in encouraging young people to find out what they believe. But there can also be candidates that are not, that simply don't grasp the attention or don't see the investment in young voters. And yet, here's one of the important things that we know, that if a political party invests in young people, they're typically going to have that voter for an extremely long period of time. Investing in that voter is going to directly impact that voter's outcomes, and encouraging them to vote early on is going to encourage them to vote in future elections. So it's these really fascinating things about building a habit. The candidates themselves can really impact based on how they talk about who they are. Young people today do not think about voting as a duty. And this is one of the big differences between young people and older citizens, is this example of young people see voting as an opportunity or as a choice. When they're told it's a responsibility or a duty, they back away from that. And so that's an important way in thinking about information campaigns, that young people are not willing to think through and not willing to commit to voting. Partisan politics. One of the most interesting things that I've really seen in the past several years is that young people are disappointed with the political parties and the polarization that we've seen in American politics. And it is a challenge that we rethink how we do what we do. And again, this is often a young person's perspective, like, how do we change the system? And so there are ways in which teaching young people about how do the political parties work and what their purpose is that really helps us to develop a dialogue about why has politics become this partisan landscape as it is today. And then lack of access to accurate information. When we have a lack of access to information, young people are less likely to turn out. When they don't feel like they can make an educated choice, they're less likely to vote. There's also the larger question about information access, right? Accurate information access. And again, this is part of the challenge that we face, that we need to be teaching young people about media literacy, meaning how do we evaluate arguments that are made? How do we think about policy choices, and what does that mean? So part of that is also identifying, what does it mean to me? What do these issues mean to me? How do I think through these complex, complicated issues? I often talk about the need for young people in politics today because the problems that we're dealing with are complex, complicated policy issues, right? What we call wicked problems. So we need new ways to think through these problems that we face. We need new ways to adjust and work through. We need new opportunities to think through old information. So there's different things that we can do about it. Most importantly is discussing the issues with young people, right? Young people today are certainly thinking through issues of immigration, issues of paying off student loans, but they're also worried about basic things like finding a job. We can encourage young people to be self-reflective, thinking about what they believe, what matters to them, but also encouraging them to ask questions about political issues, ask questions to candidates, ask questions about their political environment, as well as listen to what those answers are and see how they fit. Asking peers to participate. Some of the best people to teach young people about voting behavior are other young people. Not only is it a comfort issue, but it's also an issue of making the information accessible and in terms that young people understand. I always joke with my students that I've never been hippin' with it and will never be hippin' with it. So when they come up with when they have a new word, right, that I don't know, I certainly ask them to define it. But encouraging each other, it's about that camaraderie. It's about that sense of belonging and about encouraging young people to know their value and what it means to other people to have an influence. Community engagement. There are real opportunities to talk with young people within our communities and to host opportunities like this and talking about what are ways in which young people can be engaged in politics. And it doesn't always have to be about voting. It could be part of the conversation that we talk about, the West Virginia legislator that was 18 when he went into office. So running for office, thinking about opportunities to talk about issues and to work on issues at the state and local level. One of the biggest ways that increase trust in elections for young people is young people being election volunteers. And they can do that in primary elections. They can do that by volunteering at the registrar's office. And these are ways that tend to increase trust in the outcome of elections. We can always make registration easier. We now have the national voter registration form that then gets specified into what information that the state needs. And so we could make registration easier. You could do it on your phone, which is very simple now that most registration is online. For college students, it's about offering drop boxes or even offering a polling place on campus. So these are real opportunities to let young people know about ways in which they can engage. So 3 major takeaways. One is that there is a developmental process for identity, for a political identity development, and that this process takes time and that there are specific steps that young people go through in order to come to be at the different stages of identity. There are specific factors that increase youth participation, and there's specific factors that decrease youth participation. And we can make choices as a society as to which ones we want to do and which ones we do not want to do. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank you all for coming and being part of this conversation today. And as Robert said before, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A and comments in the chat. Thank you so much.
So folks, let's give Dr. Gentry a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. And let's take 20 minutes or so of questions before Dr. Gentry has to run to her next class. So Faye would like to know, in your opinion, why have the civics curriculum disappeared in public schools?
So this is an area that's really interesting. What we used to call in politics political socialization, we now call civic engagement. And we've actually seen this happen more frequently. States are less likely to offer a civics curriculum, but there are some states that have revamped their civics curriculum, right? 16 states that have revamped their civics curriculum. There's a number of challenges. I think one of the most important things that it has impacted the civics curriculum is the focus on language arts and science, because those are standardized tests that determine a state's placement and ranking within one of the 50. And so when we've shifted emphasis away from social studies curriculum, many states eliminated their civics curriculum and literally eliminated the class called civics that taught young people about engaging in public discourse, about voting, about making decisions, and even being leaders. So there's a real opportunity to think through the policy choices that we've really made in the past 40 years and its impact on youth voting. But yes, there has been fewer emphasis and less hours in social studies, which is where the civics curriculum often has been because of the renewed emphasis on standardized testing. And we've seen this across the board with, there is a standardized test for civics. We've seen decreases for the past 20 years in civics education and the civics outcomes. So young people knowing what a governor is. And so these are big challenges that we face. Thank you so much for your question.
Nancy writes, the young people that she converses with see no favorable candidate, at least at the national level. They don't want to align their name with any candidate they think is odious, which in their opinions includes most of them. So what can you say to that?
So at the national level, remember, that's often where young people participate. Again, it's about finding those inspiring candidates, and those can be at the local and state level. Another way that we can frame it, instead of doing candidate-centered politics, where the emphasis is on the person rather than the political party or the platform, is that young people are really energized by issue voting. So thinking about what issues are politically important to young people, what issues are on their mind, even at the state level, and encouraging young people to think about, well, there are impacts that you have, not just with candidates, but also with ballot initiatives. And many states have ballot initiatives on a ballot during a presidential election year. And so these are big decisions that young people can be influential on, and thinking through what do I believe? How do I understand this? And then why does it matter? And so one of the ways that we can do that is shifting to thinking about the issues that are important to young people.
An anonymous attendee asks, have you found any participatory breakdown by gender, race, religion, region, rural versus urban, college versus non-college, etc.?
Yes, I could answer all of those. Young women tend to vote more than young men. The same characteristics are going to come out in the population are going to come out with young people, in that young whites tend to vote more. Part of that is the increase in civic education in schools that tend to be suburban. And so thinking about where people live, what region people live in, right? There tends to be much more participation in states that have rules and regulations that allow easier access to the ballot, easier access to registration, and provide more information about the process in places where young people are. So we tend to find that the common trends that we find for young people, right? Young people who are in college versus non-college youth, college youth tend to vote more than non-college youth. So I think that was the 4 groups. But there are real opportunities that we have to improve this, and that we have seen real improvements in numbers of civic education with specific populations, especially Hispanic populations and African-American populations, where there's an increased emphasis on civic education. And that can happen in a wide variety of areas.
So just an observation from Steve. He has a question about predicting someone's political affiliation by their college major. He notes that I've seen college kids who major in applied STEM fields like engineering, pharmacy, computer science, physics, etc., Also in accounting tend to favor conservative candidates, and students majoring in non-tech majors seem to favor liberal candidates. Have you seen this in any of your classes or in any of your research? And if so, do you have any ideas why?
Yeah, so we tend to see this. It's really interesting. Um, and it comes down to fiscal responsibility and where government should and should not. So two big issues that young people think about that are going to split are one is fiscal responsibility. And what I mean by that is how does government spend money or choose not to spend money? And so what types of policy areas does government choose to spend money on versus not choose to spend money on? That's important to young people. The other one for those STEM majors and applied sciences or applied business tend to be about regulatory policy. So tend to be about government intervention. So thinking about the impact that government has on people's everyday lives. So it tends to be the case that young people are thinking through at actually a deeper level, whether or not they want government to be more influential and whether or not or less influential, right? Big government versus smaller government. But also in thinking about fiscal responsibility and thinking about, is government spending money responsibly? And those tend to be some of the biggest differences with young people in their majors is where's the money spent?
Yeah. So Nancy and Diane asked similar questions about 30 seconds apart. Diane asks, how much does the inconvenience of registering and voting in a college student's college town district versus in their home residence affect whether or not they vote and how they vote? And then Nancy asks, do you encourage college students to vote in their home districts or register in their college state?
So at the end of the day, it's the choice of the college student. And I am always going to side on the choice of the college student because there have been a lot of state rules and regulations that have disqualified voters like myself because someone else is making the decision, such as the local registrar. So there are these challenges that we've seen a number of court cases about how registrars have treated young people in providing additional questionnaires to determine residency. But at the end of the day, I'm always going to side on the point of where the student makes their choice. And I always try and stay away from the home district because fascinatingly, and this is a little known fact, so you all can have this. Little known fact, the United States Census determines young people in college where they are 9 months out of the year, which is in their college town. That is where they're counted for the census. So this directly impacts federal and state tax dollars to that particular area. And it affects representation because those young people are counted in their college towns, not where their parents or guardians live. So it's these really interesting elements. And I think part of the reason why I'm thinking the way that I do is really because of when the choice has been taken away and then young people become disenfranchised. And so I certainly want young people not only to be able to know what the policy issues are and to vote on the policy issues, but to also have the opportunity to vote where they choose to vote. Because it might be the case that they live in a state that's a highly competitive state and they want to have an influence on those elections. Right. It tends to be the case that young people that are voting, if they vote in their college town, they're more likely to participate because of the difficulty in the process of absentee ballots. And that is simply an administrative challenge. And so that tends to impact not just where young people vote, but the likelihood that they do vote. And remember, young people, once they've lived in their college town for 30 days, they're eligible to vote. And there's a national piece of legislation that is trying to make this information more accessible to the public and to create kind of a national law for accessibility to the ballot. We'll see.
Jenny asks, what are your personal thoughts on Newark, New Jersey, and them lowering their voting age to 16? Do we know more about their voter turnout for that age group of 16 to 18? Do we know why they did this?
Yeah, so for Newark, New Jersey, it is only for the school board elections. And so the reason for the decrease is because 16 and 17-year-olds, right, as what is it? Are they freshmen and sophomores? It's been so long since I've been in high school.
Thereabouts.
Yeah, sophomores and juniors,
Yeah.
that they have been in the educational system, they have thoughts about the educational system, and they're impacted by the choices that are made by a local school board. And so the reason for decreasing the age is to make the opportunity for young people to participate and have their voices heard in a way that they haven't really before. And so we globally, we have seen decreases in voting to age 16. But again, there tends to be more drop off the younger you go. And part of the reason why that is developing that political identity and where young people are in that process.
So, Linda, we're just trying to do our best to get young people to vote, but Linda wants to take it one step further and wants to know how we can get young people involved in serving in local government, whether it's appointed or elected positions. She notes, in my town, we need many volunteers to work on town committees like finance committee, conservation, etc., but we get very few young volunteers. Most of these committees are filled with seniors. How can we work with younger voters in town to work on issues at the local level and get them on committees?
Trusted partners. That's the best place to start. So these are people within your community that are trusted partners that interact with young people every day. So for instance, it could be people like myself on my college campus that I know. We literally just started it this year, is to build a relationship with the town of Bridgewater, and it having students meet with the town manager once a month, and then they go to council meetings and talk with council about the issues that students are facing, but also answer their questions. And so some of it is about finding trusted partnerships and building collaboration with other organizations within the community that engage young people. And so big thing is finding trusted partners that young people already interact with, to let them know about these opportunities. The other thing is letting young people know upfront what the roles and responsibilities are and the time commitment, especially for college students. Knowing that level of time commitment is important because they do have a lot of time management. And then last but not least is collaborating with other organizations that have young people involved with them. And so, yeah, we need to make sure that we're engaging young people, because this is a challenge that we're facing in governance, is many older people are participating and yet very few young people. I mean, go and look at your polling station. That's an excellent example of a place where there's a real opportunity, and yet very few young people participate.
We'll take one or two more questions. An anonymous attendee. Well, first of all, let me note that I saw that President Biden joined TikTok this weekend. An anonymous attendee asks, with social media platforms altering their algorithms to diminish the prevalence of political posts, have you seen any clever ways of addressing this, given that most of the young people access information through social media?
That's a really hard question, because you're right. The algorithms, because of the backlash that many social media platforms have faced because of their coverage or lack of coverage in politics, I'm not sure that there's a regulatory approach that would work. But the big thing is, again, thinking about trusted partners. So thinking about social media personalities that work to engage young people. And these are real opportunities to not only have conversations, but real opportunities to think about being role models for young people and what their political identity is. So strategic way to get more posts is I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to that, because I think social media platforms have been really careful after the backlash that they've received from Congress based on the algorithms. And so the big thing is about sharing stories, right? And even thinking about social media as small communities, because many a time the small communities of how people interact with one another is really what happens and what matters in politics.
So, folks, we're going to begin to wrap it up. If you enjoyed this morning's program, please let us know in the chat. Let Dr. Gentry know how much you appreciate her time. I did want to read a comment from JM. They write, as older voters, we should follow the lead of young people who need clear and concise information and not just vote based on party lines or how we voted in the past. Not just in presidential elections, but especially in congressional races. What you've offered today is a ray of hope for the future of our country, this desire to have more knowledge before casting a vote. Sarah says, thanks so much. Kathy says this was excellent. Janet says, definitely appreciated your insight. Thank you. Steve says, tremendous talk. It was very interesting, he says. Patty says, thank you for this enlightening presentation. I learned much. Jackie says, thanks so much for your time. Interesting and such an important topic. Thank you for the work you do with young voters. Jenny says, this was awesome. Faye says, great talk. She learned a great deal. Jody says, very informative. I will try to encourage our children to vote. Humara says, many thanks. I'm forwarding this to all my election leader colleagues. Kathy says, excellent presentation. Lots of great info. Thanks so much. Tara says, thanks so much. As a 75-year-old, I benefited from your knowledge and insights. They say, I didn't know college students could vote in their college, city, or state. Thought they had to vote in their hometown. Would think there are political and government college organizations that disseminate this information on campus, so students know this. And just for the interest of time, I'm not going to ask those questions that you also put in there. Pat says, thank you. How do I reach out later with a question? Dr. Gentry, if anyone watching live or watching the recording has any follow-up questions, how should they get in touch with you?
Feel free to email me. I'll type my email into the chat.
Great. And when you're doing that, Dr. Gentry, make sure it's going to everyone and not just all panelists.
Yep. Thank you.
It defaults to all panelists. And then Steve asks, is there a possibility for you to speak to us again after the presidential election and give your take and analysis on how young people voted?
Sure.
All right. Maybe so.
That's up to Robert.
Dr. Gentry, we'll do it again in a year. So we'll see you next February, and we'll dissect the November election and how young people voted. So I think, okay, so Dr. Gentry's email is in the chat, and I will include that in the follow-up email. Robin says, thanks so much. All right, so we're going to wrap it there because Dr. Gentry has an 11 o'clock class down the hall. So I hope everyone enjoyed this morning's program. I again want to thank the partnering libraries, the Friends of the Library, the Bridgewater College Speakers Bureau, and most importantly, Dr. Gentry. Any last words, Dr. Gentry, before we end the session?
Thank you so much for being here. And there's a real opportunity to engage young people. And there are young people that want to engage and are energized. So let's go out and engage them.
All right. Good words to end on. Thanks so much, Dr. Gentry. Have a good day.